Good morning, boys and girls, and welcome to another session of I Didn't Know That About Wyoming. I'm Mr. Dennis, and I have Cammie and Tatum.
Howdy, partner.
You bet, howdy, partner, indeed. For today, we're going to learn about the American Cowboy, history and lore, and of course, talk about how the American Cowboy became so important to our state of Wyoming. But you know, as we stop and think about the American Cowboy, I can't imagine anyone who at one time in their life didn't imagine being a
Cowboy.
A cowboy or a cowgirl. That's exactly right. In fact, you know what they used to call a cowgirl?
No.
A calico. That was because of the calico design that they would oftentimes wear. Now today, of course, we just call them good old cowgirls. And that's a better name for them, isn't it? Yes. And in fact, cowboys, your age, used to be called cowpokes. You know why?
No.
Well, because as they would bring the cattle in to the headrail and start to put them on the trains, they had young boys like yourself who would take sticks and they'd start to prod the cattle with the stick onto the train, and thus you became known as a cowpoke. Well, today we use the terms cowboys and cowgirls. You know, as we think about that romantic life of the American cowboy that we all dreamed about, imagine riding that wide open prairie, just you and your horse and your 6-gun by your side. What a romantic life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, the reality is that as we think about the history and lore of the American cowboys, much of what we come to know and come to understand come from such folk figures as Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, Bat Masterson, and even some of the famous outlaws like Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, and the famous Kate Smith, cattle rustler. Well, from these figures, there's much of their stories that is true, that gives us the lure and the love of the West. But through 10-cent novels, we find that some of their life was stretched just a little bit. And so we find that some of the things that we read about them, some of the stories and the events around their lives, maybe weren't quite as exciting as we thought they were. So, as we contemplate the aspect of the American cowboy, for many of us, these images come also through the Western movies. This was long before you guys were raised, but Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, such Western characters as John Wayne. You guys like John Wayne movies? Yeah? Yeah. Hopalong Cassidy, one of the early ones that Mr. Dennis used to watch. And of course, for those cowgirls, Annie Oakley. And for some of us, Quigley Down Under, a more modern Western movie. And the most famous of all that has become a legend amongst the Western folk stars is that of Shane. Well, we think of these Western heroes, and in our minds we conjure us riding in as the hero that's going to save the young maiden, or is going to save the ranch from being taken over by the bank, or we ride in to save the herd from the rustlers that are coming down. And of course we always come out victorious, and the heroes at the end, don't we? Well, this image of the American cowboy isn't quite exactly what the American cowboy was all about. Now, sometimes as we think about this history, we think about those times in those cities that seem to be kind of rough and tough, of those cowboys standing off face to face, ready to shoot it out on Main Street. Well, the reality is that although there probably were some times in which there was a cowboy or two who got kind of wild and they began to shoot, very seldom did any of them ever get killed. There may have been a shot fired, and by then the other one would run away and hide in the alley. In fact, in reality, only 2 famous shootouts are actually recorded in history. The first is that of the shootout of the OK Corral. This was with Wyatt Masterson and some of the other famous lawmen. The truth about this one is, it lasted less than a minute.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's short.
Now, in Wyoming, we actually have a shootout that took place between the ranchers and the cattlemen, and we'll talk more about this in one of our later series. But in this particular battle, it lasted over 3 days. In fact, it wasn't until they called the army in that they actually came to settle the disagreement that was taking place between the cattlemen and the sheepmen. But even in this, during the shootout, very few people were shot, some were wounded. Most of the killing that took place in this particular battle took place far before the shooting occurred at the ranch there. The cattlemen actually hired Texas Rangers from down south to come in and started to actually murder some of the homesteaders. And it became a very dark period in our Wyoming history, but also a very important part of our history as we talk about the cattlemen and the sheepmen and how they eventually came to work together so that we could have the industry of the sheep and cattle that we have today. Well, let's talk truly about the American cowboy. The American cowboys started from the Vaqueros down in Mexico. They were the ones who truly taught many of the early cowboys here in America not only how to ride, but how to rope and how to actually wrangle and take care of cattle. It was because of the Vaqueros that much of the attire that we're wearing today came about, because we learned from them the importance of each part of the attire that we have on today. Now we're going to talk about that in a different series, but just so that we understand that as we look at the image of the American cowboy, the attire, the skills of roping, the skills of riding, the skills of wrangling and taking care and roping cattle literally came from these early Vaqueros who taught us. Now from these Vaqueros, they would take and they would drive longhorns of mavericks being unbranded and wild cattle that they would go through and ride through the thickets and the brush and find and locate and bring into large herds. Then they would drive them north into Texas. Well, here's where the true American cowboy began. Young boys and sometimes girls like yourself would hire on with these large ranches for the primary purpose of rounding up, branding, and then taking these cattle to market. As they did so, they began to develop and create trails, which we call the great cattle trails or cattle drives of today. In our next series, we're going to be talking about these cattle drives. What were they like? Where did they go? And what impact did they really have on Wyoming? I hope that you've enjoyed our series today about the American cowboys and will want to watch our next series as we talk about cattle drives.